is called Reflecting on LGBT Lives, and we hope it's going to be a reflective conversation about our lives as LGBT individuals, particularly LGBT women and non-binary folk. And the idea is that it's going to just be that kind of open conversation to hear a little bit more about each other's experiences. We want it to be somewhere where we can learn and be open, and it's a very compassionate space. You're at Kairos, so Kairos is a women's space in Johnston, but we work right across Renfrewshire, and sometimes we do larger events as well. So we're a very compassionate space where we want to learn about each other and the world around us. So tonight is no exception. It's going to be a conversation filled with love, I hope. Just some practical things. Annie, give us a wave, Annie. Annie's doing all the technical things tonight. So we've got the chat box. Feel free to, throughout the conversation, ask questions in the chat box. We will have half an hour at the end for all of the guests to jump in, all of the audience to jump in and ask any questions you might want. But if you prefer to just type them in throughout and we'll pick them up, please do that. Annie's going to spotlight the speakers throughout so that you can see them, and it's going to be a recorded session. So if you'd oh, here I am, spotlighted. So if you'd prefer to be not included in that film, you could just turn your camera off. It'll be posted on our social media pages. We're going to have about a 10-minute break, around 10 to 6, 7 o'clock, 5 or 10 minutes, just for refreshments, and then when we come back, we'll have the Q&A. So the first part of the session is just going to be the conversation, and then hopefully your mind will start whirring and you'll think of lots of things that you might want to ask and talk about and share about your own lives and experiences. And I think that is about it. You are welcome to keep your cameras off or on, whichever you prefer, and we would love to see your faces, but if you prefer to just sit back and relax, you're welcome to do that too. And if I can ask you all to stay muted while the conversation is ongoing. So it's over to Jules now, who is my co-host, and she's going to start the introductions from the guests.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jules, and I am a volunteer down at Kairos. I figure I'll just start off with myself, so then other people can introduce themselves how they like as well. I am 28. I was outed as bi when I was like 14, 15 or so. And in the last few years, I've been coming to the realization that I'm actually also non-binary. And I'm kind of going through navigating all that and figuring all that out, while also at the same time unpicking a lot of the experiences that I've had that have been based on like this perception of me as a woman as well. So it's been fun. I don't know. But yeah, that's me. I tend to make bad jokes on the internet a lot, and that's about it. Have tartan curtains. They often get pointed out in Zoom calls. That became my nickname in a Zoom meeting last night, actually. So if we could ask Katie now to introduce herself.
Do you mean me or do you mean Katie?
Oh, Katie Leck, sorry.
Katie too. Hi everybody, I'm Katie and I'm 31, as some of you might have heard, very newly 31, hence the party things. I sit on the equalities side of things at Kairos when I can get there. I work a bit of a full-time crazy corporate job during the day, so it's a bit of a juggling act. You might see a couple of cats rolling around, apologies. Also a crazy cat mother. I can't really say, obviously everyone has their own story, so I've kind of always known that I was bi. That was what I figured, and then I've come to the realization sort of throughout my 20s and into my 30s that I'm much higher on the Kinsey scale than I thought. I am quite newly engaged, have a lovely fiance that I live with, and yeah, that's me.
Thank you very much, Katie. And if we can ask Ellie to introduce herself.
So hi, my name is Ellie. I use she, her pronouns. I'm 20 and I am currently a student at UWS. I study at both the Paisley and Ayr campuses because I'm doing physics with education, which is a lot of fun, but it's interesting. And I also am quite heavily involved in the Students' Union at UWS. So I'm currently the Women's Officer for the Students' Union. And that's I was actually just elected for a second term, so that's until next year, and I started that back in 2019. Before that, from 2018 to 2019, I was the LGBT plus officer, because I'm the L and the T in LGBT plus. So yeah, that's kind of who I am. And then I also I get very involved in sort of activism and things like that, and the particularly when it comes to feminism and LGBT plus rights. And I am on the organising team for Trans Pride Scotland, which is very exciting, but also very stressful because we've got our first ever virtual Pride the day after tomorrow. And so I am very busy right now, but I absolutely love it to bits. I have so much fun with it. So yeah, that's me.
Magic. Thank you, Ellie, and thank you for taking the time out of, I mean, you're only 2 days away from this massive event, so thank you for coming and talking to us. And now if you could ask Susan to introduce herself, please.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks to Katie and to Jules for asking me to do this. So I'm Susan. I'm just about to turn 39, but I've just been informed that maybe doesn't have to count this year, so maybe I can stay for a bit longer. I'm involved both with the LGBT community and with other things in a number of capacities. I'm a sessional worker for LGBT health and wellbeing within their mental wellbeing project. I'm a member and a volunteer with Glasgow Disability Alliance, where among lots of other things, I was part of setting up an LGBT disabled persons group, who I'm still involved with, but not involved in the running anymore. And I've recently, just a couple of weeks ago, started a job working on a project looking at social care reform. So I'm quite heavily involved, particularly in the kind of disability advocacy, disability rights movements, and the intersections between that and my, LGBT identity. Lockdown's been interesting. My partner and I got married 4 days before lockdown. And then, our first few months of married life have been 24 hours a day in lockdown together. So that's been, it's been interesting. If anything can test a relationship, it's that. But we've come through that strongly. And we also have 2 very cute, very annoying, very adorable cats. So yeah, that's me.
Magic, thank you so much. You're juggling so many things, and I've heard about the LGBT health, the disability group a couple times, and before lockdown had been thinking of going and joining at one point, but I just never got around to it. So I'm really glad to just knowing that it exists still kind of gives me heart in a sense. Yeah. So thank you for joining us. And Frankie, if you would like to introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Frankie. I'm very nervous. So I've got terrible lighting as well. I use they them pronouns, and I'm non-binary. I'm a volunteer at Kairos for a few months now. I'm 22 and I wasn't informed it didn't count this year, so I'm stuck with that. I don't really know what to say. I used to run a group when I lived in Manchester called Non-Binary Northwest, and we worked with a few other organisations, and we did some work with the universities with foster carers to sort of raise awareness of non-binary people, because it was about 2018 where most people hadn't heard we existed. I've also got a terrible internet connection, so if you can't hear me at any point, then just let me know. Okay, yeah, that's me.
That's brilliant. I actually didn't know that about what you got up to down in Manchester, so it's really interesting to hear about that. And
I kind of forgot somehow.
yeah, I even in asking people to introduce themselves, I forgot to give my pronouns and to ask other people to give their pronouns too. So thank you everybody for going ahead and doing that anyway. And my fellow co-host Katie, have you? I mean, I don't think you really introduced yourself as such.
No, I didn't. Thanks, Jules. So I'm Katie. I'm the manager at Kairos, and I'm a lesbian, and I've been married for 4 years. It took me about a decade to say lesbian without it feeling embarrassing, but I think I've definitely got there now. So I'm really excited this evening to have a really good, reflective conversation with you all, and I'm gonna hopefully kick off the conversation without my cat Fluff interrupting us. She is there in the background in a little pouch on the radiator. Cleaning herself. You can't quite see her, but she's cleaning herself, so she'll come and join us soon, no doubt. So the first question for this evening is, what was life like growing up for you as an LGBT individual? And I wonder, Jules, whether you might want to kick us off.
Sure, no problem. Well, I grew up between two villages in the countryside in Renfrewshire, where in the 90s, so beginning school, there's still many of the effects of Section 28, and it was odd. It was almost an in-between kind of time, looking back on it, because as it turned out, in the village where I spent most of my life growing up, I had some neighbours that were a gay couple, and they had these two lovely big dogs, and they were very prominent in the community, as in the local community. They were on the community council, and they were doing all sorts of stuff, and they were well liked. But that was because there was a sense of, I suppose, like, yeah, they're gay, but they're our gays. And I strangely never had any shame, any sense of internalized shame about attraction to women, the way that some of my friends have had to deal with. Because thanks to my aunts and my cousins, my aunts came out in the mid-90s, before I can remember. So I've always had my lesbian aunties, and it's always just been just another thing in my family and kind of normal. However, that was even before I knew the word lesbian. It was used as a dirty and derogatory word. It was something that I was called as an insult regularly in primary school, and I didn't understand why. But I thought that it must be a bad thing. And then my mom was like, your aunties are lesbians, right? And I was like, oh. She said, you know what it means? No. Okay. And then I learned, and I was like, oh, why is that seen as such a bad thing? I don't understand. Because within my own bubble, the road had already been paved ahead of me by my elders. So I never had any of this, oh God, oh no, the way that I've had to help some of my friends through with feeling this shame and this, like, oh, the sense of praying the gay away kind of thing, also from a Roman Catholic background, so that adds to the fun. But yeah, so there were no resources in the area. I was quite surprised in the last year hearing that there were LGBT groups and clubs and even discos in Renfrewshire and Paisley back in the 70s and 80s. Because certainly when I was a kid, there was nothing for me. And thanks to some family drama, as often happens, the only other queers in my family were quite distant. So I didn't have any. It was certainly normalized, but I didn't have any positive influences around me, because they just, for their own well-being, they stayed distant from other parts of our family. So it felt very like, I don't know, it was like everybody else was telling me I was wrong and weird, when I was like, but I don't, how am I wrong and weird? And then you get in the media these messages of like, yeah, it's okay to be gay. Meanwhile, everybody around me is still being weird about it in some way. After I was outed in high school, generally girls saw me as kind of like, they wanted to shy away from me quite a bit. They wanted to move away. In the changing rooms, they started queuing up to use the disabled toilet to change in because they didn't want to change in front of me who always stared at the wall, you know. Whereas guys, you know, while girls would lean away in fear, guys would lean in thinking, oh, and start asking me very inappropriate and personal questions and stuff. So I always had this attitude of, yeah, I'm bi, fight me about it, cowards, you know, like, come at me. Whereas when it comes to gender, woof, that is a whole other thing. I actually messaged my friend earlier today. She only realised in the last year and a half that she's gay, and she's my age. And I said to her, did you grieve that you're not, you know, normal? And she said, no, it felt like a relief. I was like, huh, because even earlier today, there was that sense of, it was like an inner child in me that just so desperately wanted to not be the freak and to just fit in and be normal. And it's very, I don't know, I'm still coming to terms with the idea of how I have that with regards to gender, but not with regards to my sexual orientation. I don't know. But yeah, it was very isolating. And I used to wish that I could go and live in the big cities, like in Glasgow and Edinburgh or London, where or even, you know, like San Francisco or something, where I could find the community where there was none here. And it's been amazing and enlightening in the last few years to have that now.
It's a big change, isn't it?
Big change. So excuse me if I'm a bit emotional today. I will probably cry a couple of times, but yeah, my eyes are already puffy from crying earlier. It's it's been a lot, but in a good way. And that's me rambling on.
Thanks, Jules. I can really relate to that whole idea of feeling defensive, feeling like, I remember when I first came out, it was yeah, I'm gay, and what? That same feeling of,
yeah,
to protect myself here, I need it to not be a big deal, even though it is. And every time I talked about being gay, people would be very critical of that and be like, oh, you're always talking about being gay. And it made it very difficult to accept that part of who you are and explore it. And I think that's why, for me, I went down the route of becoming extremely gay. Like, I went full dyke on my life. When I was about 17, 18, totally went against all kind of gender norms. I shaved my head. I was, and I absolutely loved it. I thought, you know, this is who I want to be right now.
It's liberating.
It was liberating, but I felt like I needed to do that in order to prove to myself and other people, do you know what, I am gay. This is real. This is actually who I am. And I wonder how other people feel about that process of adolescence, of like reflecting on who you need to be. Has any of the other guests got any feelings about any of that? Should I pick on someone? Go on, Ellie.
I had a very sort of weird relationship with sort of working out that I was queer growing up. So I went to an all-boys school, so that was fun. That was a very interesting experience because I grew up in, I was from a very working class family in a very posh area. So I'm from Cheltenham originally, which most people have probably heard of for the races. It's that sort of area. And I went to an all-boys grammar school. And at this point, when I was very young, I mean, I know it's a cliche, but I did always know that there was something up. I just didn't know really what it was. And I actually did know that trans people existed because, I don't know, like my dad's second cousin twice removed or something like that is trans. And so like I'd heard the word before, like I was aware it was a thing, but that's not what I am. God, no, that's not me. So I went to an all boys school. that was very challenging because it was when I was at that school that I worked out that I was trans. I was about 15 or so at the time when I actually fully had the epiphany of like, oh my gosh, because I'd just been reading like online articles and I just came across it and I was like, okay, this is a thing. Let's just suppress that for a bit and move on. So yeah, I mean, content warning for homophobic bullying, but I was homophobically bullied at school, like most people who don't sort of conform to, very strict sort of gender norms and gender binaries, are, especially at an all-boys school. When you go to an all-boys school and you take ballet classes at the weekend, you get bullied, unfortunately. And so that was very much a thing for me. But the thing is that it was weird because I was, having homophobic slurs and things like that thrown at me. And I was like, right, so this doesn't make sense because I'm not attracted to guys, but also there is a part of it that's like, actually they're right. And I was like, how does that make sense? So yeah, I had the epiphany when I was like 15, and then I moved to a different school. Not because I worked out that I was trans, it was just because in England you have like sixth form and everything afterwards. So I went to a different school for sixth form, and I went to, this was a co-ed school. And at this point, I knew that I was trans. I hadn't told anyone I was trans. It was still very much a thing that I was just trying to ignore and just move on with my life, keep it away. No, don't think about that. And then the second whole school assembly that I had at that new school was by the LGBT plus society at the school. And they were talking about what it means to be trans or non-binary. Like that was the second full school assembly I had at that school, which was brilliant. The school was still awful when it came to LGBT plus stuff. But in comparison to pretty much any other school, like they were brilliant. So having that sort of assembly and having it very normalized, and it still took me ages to actually come out to anyone, but about 18 months into being at that school, which incidentally, because it's sixth form, was only 6 months away from leaving that school, I eventually came out to my best pal who was also non-binary. So I was like, they'll get it because like they're going through it themselves. And then they forced me to go along to the LGBT plus society, where all of a sudden I discovered that literally half of my year group were in that society. We had half is a bit of an exaggeration, but we had a year group of 120 people, and 30 of them were in the LGBT plus society, which I thought was very interesting, just because that is obviously a lot higher than statistics tend to show. And I've been theorizing that, maybe actually creating an environment where people can just be themselves encourages people to come out. Who'd have thunk it? But all of a sudden, having that community around me made all the difference. And within like a few weeks, I was like, oh my gosh, I can actually do this. I can actually come out. And I ended up coming out to most people before leaving school. And then I came out to my parents just before I moved up to university, which wasn't deliberate. I didn't deliberately plan on, oh, by the way, mum, dad, I'm trans. Also, I'm moving 400 miles up north next week, because that's what happens. But that's how it happened. And my parents were very accepting and all that. And there was never any doubt of my sexuality. As soon as I realized that I was trans, I was like, oh, okay, that means I'm gay too, I'm lesbian. And just sort of slowly but surely embracing that and embracing every element of my identity. But certainly growing up, there were a lot of challenges being thrown at me left, right, and center. Most of which I wish didn't happen, but at the end of the day, they did. And just looking back at it and thinking, you know what, that was not great, but it happened. And it's certainly given me a lot of experience in terms of who I am today. So yeah.
It's quite incredible, really, that I know you said at the start, Ellie, that you're 20, so to have experienced all that and be here talking about your identity and who you are and being proud of it. I don't think I would be capable of that when I was 20. I'm 30 now, so like I said at the beginning, it took me a long time to even accept the word lesbian into my life. So I feel very proud of our younger generation for accepting themselves and fighting really hard to tell the world that it's okay that we exist. So thank you very much. I wonder, Susan, would you like to share anything about your experiences?
Yeah, I mean, different parts of both Ellie and Jules that I could relate to. Like Jules, I was fortunate to come from a very accepting family, and not to be the only gay person in the family either. So that was kind of, it kind of set the scene for that, if you like, that it was normalised to a certain extent, and it was okay. School was probably a bit different from that, as it is for a lot of people. Yeah, the school I was, certainly the first secondary school that I went to, where it was, I'm a wheelchair user, and it was a school for people with physical disabilities, and really, the idea of you as a disabled person having any sexuality, let alone being LGBT, was kind of not talked about. So trying to kind of figure out your identity within that space of, this is a part of your life that we don't really address, was a bit difficult. I was initially, when I first started to explore it and came out to a good friend, when I was mid-teens, was then outed by that friend to some of the kind of meaner people, I guess, who, there was a lot of sniggering and kind of nudging each other, and the wee pass, nothing that was overt that would be picked up by any of the staff, but that sort of underhanded sort of whispering went on, which wasn't pleasant. But then it was that duality of then going home to a family who were accepting and open, and it was fine. Following that, I feel as if my journey's kind of been very kind of back and forward with it, because from coming out there, I then went on to university again, surrounded by people, but being the only wheelchair user in among thousands of people, and it felt like to be out would just be to have another part of my identity that made me stand out, and I didn't want to do that. I just wanted to blend in. So I feel like I kind of initially sort of went back in again almost. It was very quiet about it. Didn't necessarily talk about being gay. Had relationships, but that that were kind of secretive almost. It was just this whole thing of I just want to blend in, and there's too many things about me that don't allow me to do that. So if I can conceal one of them, then I will. Went on to, after university, and a period of time out of work, went on to quite a kind of toxic work environment where I wasn't the only gay person by any stretch of the imagination, but it wasn't somewhere that was safe to be out. So I wasn't really for the time that I was there, which was a number of years. And it's only like Ellie was saying, it's only really in recent years of finding a community around about me, a community that where it might sound funny to say, but my way of existing as LGBT is okay, so it's okay to be feminine, for example, because all the kind of stereotypical representations that I saw being lesbian were more masculine presenting. So yeah, it's okay. That's okay. It's okay not to be into the club and pub scene necessarily. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just finding a space that fits me, and I feel I can fit into, and I can just be who I am without having to fit into a particular stereotype, or worry about standing out. It's actually standing out. It's okay. It's okay to have things that are unique about you. Mm. So yeah, bit of a confusing process.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the way that you describe the layers of your identity that you maybe wanted to keep hidden so that you weren't, I suppose, judged even more. And I'm sure that lots of people here can relate to that there might be things about themselves that sometimes they don't share because it's a little bit easier to keep that hidden. I know I don't always, like if someone assumes that I've got a husband instead of a wife, I don't always correct them if it doesn't feel safe to do it. And sometimes you think, oh, should I have corrected them? Should I be that person that every time someone gets it wrong, I correct them? But I'm sure we'll all know here that sometimes it's not safe to do that, and you pick and choose when you want to tell somebody. If it feels like the right kind of person, then yeah, you can say, oh, actually it's a wife, and they go, oh, sorry, I've just made an assumption. But other times you think they're not really going to react very well if I tell them I've got a wife. So it's those decisions we make all of the time about what we want to share with people. Yeah. Thanks, Susan. Katie, where are you? Would you like to share anything?
It's interesting what you say there about sort of having to constantly come out. It's almost like a daily thing, like you say, you know, just in interactions, day-to-day interactions of, like for myself, it's, just got engaged, what's his name? And I'm like, it's not a he, it's a she. So it's all very, you know, and I think being quite feminine in presentation, I get quite a lot of, didn't think you were gay.
Yeah.
Which I've kind of, as I got older, I was very quiet in school, I grew up in a small town in the west, like much further down the west of Scotland than Paisley. Well, not much, I'd say much, but Greenock, but it feels like much further away. Even smaller than that, at Wimsby when I was really little, Roman Catholic school. Absolutely no non-hetero role models whatsoever. Knew from a very young age that something was different. I couldn't quite figure out what it was, but definitely, you know, there was something. Unfortunately, didn't have any hetero role models in my family or in the surrounds. So was a bit of a pioneer in that respect. Like I say, I knew there was something, and as I got sort of older through primary school and into high school, knew, hi fellow Greenockians, knew I wasn't hetero. Tried on bi for a while, as I got into sort of upper of high school, and again, I really associate, like, sort of really feel you when you're saying being quite fight me about it. I was quite fight me about it, having been really quiet the whole way through school, and then kind of found my voice and was really quite, no, this is me and this is, here I am, kind of thing, and let's discuss. But then the older I got, felt that bi really didn't fit me. Was much higher on the Kinsey scale than I first thought. But then for me, I've always, I think looking back now, feel like my sexuality has always been really quite fluid. There's been times in my life where I have had long-term relationships with men, I've had long-term relationships with women, I'm now engaged to a woman. So it's, but then not 100% convinced that I wasn't trying too hard with the men in my life, rather than just accepting fully that actually I'm definitely much more leaning towards women and have been since my sort of early 20s. But for me, I think pan felt a bit more comfortable for me than bi did. It kind of embodied it a little bit better than being really fixed into, bi felt quite limiting to me. Because for me it is sort of, I've always been attracted to sort of people and personalities, and used to get quite a lot of stick for that. I think there's quite a lot of snark around pan and, being something other than the LGBT per se. Got quite a lot of snark of trying too hard, or, just trying to be a bit different. And So it was a bit problematic. But I think when I really came into my own sort of growing up was, so we get been in grew up in small towns, etc. Went to Paisley Uni and studied languages, and then as part of that I had to do a year abroad in the middle of that, and moved to Spain for a year initially, and just totally found in the weirdest section of Spain. You wouldn't have expected it, like really sort of, it's quite Catholic by culture, obviously, sort of the west of Spain where nobody goes. It's very, very Spanish, no English influence really. And just found my absolute utopia of LGBT plus sort of queer community. And suddenly there was all sorts of role models for me everywhere. I worked with gay people, with trans people, with non-binary people, with lesbians. It was just at 19, just sort of coming into this and being like, okay, now I feel like I can be who I'm supposed to be now, and I've got something that I've got somewhere that I can go with it. I was a bit sort of stagnant before, going, don't really know, that way you sort of Google things when you're young and you're like, oh, but it's sort of seeing that in society, and it was really inclusive and just really, they're still my sort of family away from home. And it was just, that was the total making of me, I think, and of my sort of gender, sexuality, identity. So I'd be sort of ever grateful to them for that, to be fair.
I think thanks for that, Katie. I think there's definitely something about having somebody that you can see yourself in that we all desperately need. And I know that was definitely missing a generation or two ago, that it was very, very hard to find somebody who was like you so that you could find something about yourself. And the other thing that I thought was interesting that you said, Katie, was about the idea that we have to kind of stick ourselves in a box around sexuality. And I know there's a lot of criticism within gay communities around being bisexual or being pansexual, and the same from heterosexual communities. So it's a lack of acceptance, I think, both ways, that is always felt when, I don't know whether we're moving more towards a place where sexuality is more fluid and that's the future, but that's maybe a question for in a few minutes. I'm going to see what Frankie has to say. Frankie, where are you?
Yeah, hi. I think for me, it was a bit, I never really thought about it growing up. Not really sure why, it just never really occurred to me to sort of think about sexuality or anything. And then I don't think I ever actually came out. It's this really weird story. I was at a council building in like South Manchester, and a friend from school came in and she brought me a kitten and asked if I wanted to go gay ice skating, which was quite weird. So there was this LGBT group that was running out of there. It was just the sort of general council building. They had a youth space underneath, and I went there for careers advice, I think. And a friend from school who I hadn't seen for about 4 years just, she guessed, and I hadn't really thought about it, so I didn't know. And she just came up to me, and she had a kitten with her for some reason, and said, she was like, we're going to, the LGBT group's going ice skating next week, do you want to come? And I was like, I suppose this is me now. And then we walked about 5 miles to go get a kitten from her house, which was a bit strange. So it's not the most conventional like coming out story, but I think I'd maybe guess beforehand, because otherwise I might have reacted a bit differently. But because I was in foster care maybe the year before that, and my foster carer was a lesbian, and her partner who lived around the corner was a trans woman, and my social worker was also a lesbian, and they sort of all gravitated towards me and were just like, yeah, you'll fit there. And I was like, why does everyone read my mind? So I never really sort of had a problem with it. And then it was, I think maybe a year later that I came out as non-binary, which was a bit more confusing because I don't know, I'd never really been like a girly, inverted commas, because it's obviously a very sort of patriarchal idea, but never really sort of I associated with other girls whether it was at school or really felt drawn to any sort of gendered representation of anything. It all sort of felt a bit irrelevant to me. And then I think I heard the term non-binary and I was like, that sounds interesting. So I went, I think I was out with my mum, and I thought the best way to come out to her was to ask her if she felt like a woman. And she said that she didn't know. So we both had an existential crisis. And then I sort of eventually told her, I was like, I've heard of this term and it's quite interesting. And then I explained to her about, not necessarily feeling like at this point probably a boy or a girl, because I was about 18. And she was like, yeah, I don't know either. And I was like, okay, we'll have your identity crisis next week. She hasn't since come out, but you never know. And then because the group I went to where the kitten came from was a sort of general LGBT group, and this one, I don't know how familiar people are with the geography of north of England, but the one I went to was in Sale, which is just south of Manchester, but it was connected to a bigger hub in central Manchester near Canal Street, which is like a massive gay village. So I started going there and had a trans group. This was after I'd come out. And there was, I think it was the first time I'd really, because I didn't really have any friends prior to that, because I'd had quite a complicated existence. And this was the first time I'd really felt like I had friends and I could relate to a lot of what they were saying. And then that sort of just became my community. I started volunteering now and doing some other stuff. And then I think it's a couple of, maybe a year or two into that it started off as just sort of a meet-up in a coffee shop with other non-binary people that had either been there or had been in other places, to sort of get together because we didn't feel like there was much of a sort of space for us. Then we'd sort of met up a few times and we're coming up with some ideas and things. We sort of started to develop stuff and managed to get a grant funding from a social enterprise body. And I think that was when I became more comfortable really talking about sort of my identity and like how, and sort of really sort of thinking about how the world does operate in these quite gendered ways that I'd never really paid a great deal of attention to. And we started doing sort of various kind of work with other groups. So we worked with a charity and with a university and a foster agency. It was just a few of us that were doing that. I don't know how to end this, but yeah, I think what I'd really take away from my own experience, but also some of what the other speakers were saying, I feel like it is getting a lot easier. And obviously that's not necessarily everywhere, and there'll be a difference between smaller places and larger places and for different groups of people. But I feel a bit like what Ellie was saying about when you give people a space to come out, then they'll come out, and it becomes a lot easier from there. And I think once you've got that community and you've got that sort of sense of self and you've got that place to develop it, then you don't have to feel guilty about who you're attracted to or what your gender is or anything like that. You just you're allowed to be, and that's obviously quite liberating. And I think that's why I'm glad we're doing this, and other stuff at Kairos around LGBT experiences to not, it sounds cliche, but make people feel like they're not alone, because that's really the only way that you can explore how you're feeling and your identity and stuff, and that's important, and it is getting better, I think. I'd hope anyway, but yeah.
Thanks, Frankie. That was beautifully put. I really like the kind of theme that's come out about community, about the idea that we all need to find our people, or whoever they may be, and some of us might have already found them, some of us might have found them a few different times, and others might be still waiting. But I think there's something really nice about that whoever those people might be, when we find them, we're like, yeah, this is it. This is where my life is going to start now. I can be the full version of myself. Yeah, well, that has absolutely flown by. It's 10:02, so I think that might give us a good opportunity to have a 5-minute break, come back at 5:02, and then what I'm suggesting is we maybe just open up the conversation to everybody in this space. Our next question is about reflecting on how things have changed over the last 50 to 70 years. So if you want to go and make a cup of tea and get yourself comfortable and maybe have a reflect on that question, when you come back, we will open up the room to explore together. So the next question, and we're opening up for everyone, so feel free to jump on in. You might want to just raise your hand if you want to jump in and we can call on you. Is what do you think has changed over the last 50 to 70 years for our community, and what impact do you think that's had on our lives? So anyone want to jump in and give us an opinion? Come on, someone help me out, Jules. Go on.
I can at least start. Maybe it'll spark something in somebody else. But certainly, the fact that there's something about when you're walking down the street and clocking, maybe like somebody's got a pride flag bag on. At one point I was walking through one of the shopping centres nearby, and there was a woman, she was standing with a baby in a buggy and standing waiting for somebody who was obviously in the loo, and I went up and I was like, oh sorry, are you in the queue to go into the pharmacy next to it? And she was like, no, and she turned around and on her mask was this little pride flag right there, and there's something that just it's like safety in a sense, which is strange considering that technically I'm not unsafe there, but there's almost a sense of like, oh, you know, just in some imaginary scenario where things could go terrible in some way, there's somebody who's like flagging themselves as an ally, and now you're safe to do that, whereas in the past there was literally the practice of flagging. It still happens now, where you try, and whether it's through your fashion choices or your hairstyle or the earrings that you wear, try to signal subtly to other queers that you're family, without alerting the streets, whether it's through coloured handkerchiefs or a whole bunch of like ear cuffs there, and asymmetry, and apparently the bisexual thing, which I only learned about recently, is like rolled up jeans, but I think that's more of a running joke than anything, because it's really quite common. But
wish I'd have known that back in the day when I was trying to find my folks.
Right?
I feel like it's been snatched from me.
Wearing a carabiner clip on your trousers is apparently a lesbian signal, and I can swear there have been a couple women in my life who have come up to me and told me about how they're getting their carabiner clip through, and I was just like, huh? I didn't know about any of this stuff. But maybe it's because I didn't have to, like, I suppose, be closeted so much around my family, just because it was normalized there, and because I was already out within the rest of my life, I didn't really have any choice in the matter. I didn't look into flagging. I didn't really know it was a thing until my 20s. I had no idea flagging was a thing. I was like, oh my God, I've been alone all this time, and there've probably been all sorts of signals everywhere that I've missed. So
I speak 3 languages and lesbian is not one of them. Like, how did that happen?
There absolutely is. There's like a whole dialect. There's like all these little hints here and there. And it's
I
like,
feel
oh,
robbed.
yeah,
Just
why
want to
don't we
put
get
that
the
out there.
elders back to like detail these things out? I wound up making a couple for friends, whether it's like upon learning that they have a chronic illness, for example, is one of them, and another one being somebody figuring out that they might be gay. Like, well, here's your resources. Here's all the queer media that you may want to peruse at your leisure. Here's all this. Here's all that. But now the fact that we can communicate these things overtly, and it doesn't have to necessarily be like for there's still always a little bit of that fear of like, what if somebody's going to jump me? Like there was that lesbian couple on the bus a while back down in England, and then there was the group of women in that pub down south that it wasn't in the media, and I only heard about it through my friend who she had previously lived down that area, and so we found a contact for their friend, and as a group made little cards of support and solidarity to send down, because they had all just been beaten to a pulp by a bunch of drunk men for being visibly gay in a non-gay bar, and it's, I don't know, the fact, yeah, sorry, that's getting away from me, but yes, being able to be a little more overt without thinking I am risking my life by doing this. And even things like now, well, that's obviously not the same for everybody, especially at the moment. I still don't want to speak for you, Ellie, but for many trans women as well, the inherent risk, and just being yourself in that space. And then of course, but my friend sent me one of these wee badges, the kind of I'll go with you badge, to try and show, so see, you can wear that, and that's another little signal of, it's got the trans flag on it, which is because of course there's this whole bathroom thing, like, oh, trans women going into women's bathrooms must be somehow inherently predatory or something. But if you're going in with an ally, people are less likely to target you, as opposed to when you're alone. So it's very much the signal of like, hey, like, you can come up and ask me to go to the loo with you, and I'll go in, and then you go about your merry way kind of thing.
I love that.
It's fantastic. It's been a while for, it's been a thing for a while now, but in a sense that shows how we've gone backwards as well. We go forwards a bit and being able to be overt in our presentations, and then having to go backwards to the point of there are still people in our community who are risking their lives by being able to present as themselves. And hopefully my rambling on and on has maybe sparked something, if somebody else wants to give some input.
Yeah, I hope you don't mind if I just jump in quickly. I'm going to need to leave, so sorry for being a gab, but I need to go and pick up the fiance from work.
Right, yeah.
It's all right. No, you're all good. I don't want to just stop anybody speaking, and you all know from Kairos meetings I'm an absolute yap of hell. So like what you said about sort of flagging and sort of overtly flagging and stuff. So I mentioned in my sort of very lacking, it seems now, introduction that I work in a corporate environment. It's technically sales, but I'm a specialist in there for the technical side of things. And it's very sort of, if you've seen the series Mad Men, it's quite very old style sales. It's there's a very specific set of people, a look of people that work in sales. It's very young, it's very hetero, it's very fit in a box and look like everyone else. And what you mentioned there about the sort of overtly flagging, so I'm on the LGBT plus sort of board within the site. I'm on the Women's Network for the site, and we run quite a lot of things on the site. So we launched at the beginning of last summer a pride sort of movement on our site. We did have one for the sort of country level of the company, but we never had anything on the site in Erskine. So we'd sort of done this big launch to be a bit more visible and make it more of a, like you say, flagging it to be okay to not fit this very heteronormative stereotype that is promoted within the company on that site. And my desk is literally adorned. I mean, every sort of rainbow, any sort of, flag, pride flags, literally in every form, all of my desk. I'm very sort of open with it, in a big way, because I feel like I have that voice in that, in that corporate environment on that site and I kind of feel like I have I feel like I have to be that person to be like, I want to show people it's okay. I want you guys to feel like if you don't fit that total box, it's okay. Like, I'm here, I'm doing it, and it's fine. And I've taken a lot of stick for enough years, so I'm used to it now. And it was a really tough place to come up in corporate, being sort of openly non-heterosexual, and being, along with that, being sort of feminine in presentation. Like I mentioned before, it's very much, didn't think you were gay, didn't think. And like someone else, I can't remember who it was that mentioned before, I think it was you, Jules, that said, that really uncomfortable questioning that people feel
Yes.
automatically able to ask you as soon as they know you're not totally straight, feel that they have this ability and this agreement to come up and ask you all these questions that they would never ask anybody else. And I got that a lot in corporate, an awful lot, especially in the sort of sales, sort of drinking environment. It's all very sort of rah, rah, rah. And that was tough, but I think if I'd went into that environment where we have young apprentices that start now with us at sort of 17, if I'd went into that environment at 17, I would have just been totally terrified and been like, oh my God, I can't be out. I can't be who I am here because it's not going to be accepted. So I kind of feel like I owe it to my younger self almost to be there, to show that not everyone's following that sort of stereotype that's promoted, so that people coming in that are maybe younger, that don't know themselves well yet, that are exploring, sort of know that it's okay and that I'm an ally in that.
I love that, Katie. That kind of comes back to the idea of you being a role model, and that we all know that we need one of those people in our lives to encourage us to be ourselves. And somehow I think the LGBT community feel almost a responsibility to be that for other younger people coming up, which I think is wonderful. I know that I read a lot about LGBT history and the women that came before me to shift the conversation away from all of the hatred that existed then, and then that generation just existing was hard. But I'm so grateful for them, because without them I wouldn't have been able to get married to my wife. And I just think about the layers of incredible people who have fought for our rights, and today we can live a lot more of a content life than we would have if we were born 50 years ago. So thank you for being a role model, you angel.
Oh, thanks.
I think Ellie wanted to say something a little minute ago. If you can remember what that was now, Ellie.
Yeah, I was just going to comment about how, like, when you look at this sort of timeline, when you go from, and I mean, I'm not exactly the best qualified person here to talk about what it was like 50 to 70 years ago. I mean, I wasn't even born 21 years ago. So like, yeah, but from what I've seen, even just in the 20 odd years that I've been about, is that things are constantly shifting. Things are always moving. There's this long spectrum. Sometimes things go a little bit forward, sometimes go a little bit backwards. On the whole, we're usually moving forwards. even if it doesn't always feel like it. And I suppose that in the same way that we look back 50 years ago and think about how horrific it was that you know, for instance, to be a gay man was criminalized, it was illegal, and I hope that in 50 years time, I mean, hopefully in less than 50 years time, we'll look back and we'll think, God, 2020, can you just imagine how horrific it must have been to have no self-ID, to have, you know, debates about bathrooms of all things, and we're always moving, and I'm sure in 100 years time they'll be looking back to 2070 and thinking, gosh, can you imagine how, and you get sort of what I mean about it's always moving. And I think what both Jules and Katie were both saying about sort of different ways of flagging that you're LGBT plus, and slowly but surely it's becoming much less covert and much more overt. It's no longer, and I mean, this is certainly a generalization, but I mean, when you look back, you were having sort of literally secret languages, like Annie put in the chat, and now you have sort of code words and little things that you wear on your body to show that. I'm really lucky because I live in Govan Hill. I stay on the same street as Category as Books, and what I often see when I'm walking down the street is very explicit, very overt signals that someone is LGBT plus. You know, you walk along the street and see you know, trans flags in people's windows, and you know, people walking down the street, you know, same-sex couples who are holding hands and things like that just are very explicit and overt. And I like to think that hopefully that sort of thing will continue to be normalized, and slowly but surely we'll get to the point where it's not even a thing to be LGBT plus. It's just a fact of someone, and no one thinks anything of it. And there are certainly some communities that I'm involved in right now where that is 100% the case. Being trans is completely irrelevant for, like, I would say 70% of my life in the communities that I put myself in. It's only the 30% where I can't really control it, where actually it does matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head with the constantly evolving and changing, and I've seen that Lee and Val have put, we won't be looking back in 50 years time. Do you mean that we won't be thinking about LGBT stuff in 50 years time, Lee and Val?
No, we mean we sincerely hope we won't still be alive in 50 years time. That would put us kind of slick. That would put us just too far beyond the century.
And what
I came out about 37 years ago.
And what was that experience like?
It was very, very difficult. I came out in quite a small town. I felt I was the only one. I felt very lonely. I was involved in a church. I'd been brought up in the church, and they didn't take too kindly. I came out as gay at first, bisexual a couple of years later, pansexual now. And I think one of the things that you'll find is not only will the world around you change and continue to change and take steps forwards and backwards, your idea of yourself will continue to change. And new generations coming up will highlight new ways of looking at yourself. Because certainly the issue of kind of looking at gender now is very, very different from what it was more than 30 years ago. And it's really, you know, that one of the young ones earlier said that it's really been since about 2018 that some of the gender identities have been around. Particularly it was the non-binary. And I've always known who I was, just never had a label for it or a word for it or a description for it. But, you know, I'm quite happy at this age to be realising that actually the closest description of myself in terms of my gender identity is non-binary. So, you know, you continue to evolve within your own within yourself over the decades, and society continues to change, and you do find your safe groups, and I think bizarrely enough for Val and I, we had entirely different backgrounds. For Val and I, we're actually really quite boring and mainstream. Our son's gay, and you know, as a family, we have frequently gone to Pride together, and he's absolutely ashamed of us because we're the most straight-looking couple there, and it's and he just looks us up and down and walks off, and comes to find us when he wants fed. In fact, that's what my cousin did as well. Yeah. So yeah, we've had different experiences. Yeah. And we have a son because Val was married before.
So I see things very differently sometimes, and in that kind of 22 years ago I was married with 2 small children, and I met Lisa and I immediately fell in love, but I've never had to put a label to that. You know, I don't feel it needs a label of any description, just that I'm a woman married to a woman because that's who I fell in love with, and that's how I see it. But I just love hearing people's different, you know, descriptions of their lives, and I really wish, you know, that an organisation like yourselves existed in Inverclyde. I think it needs to happen in Inverclyde, because there's lots of people.
Here.
Yeah, a lot of people out there that need the support of it. It's just like how to get it going sometimes. It's constantly going round my mind. I work for, and I believe, you know, that also that the female organisations, feminist organisations and female spaces should be inclusive, but I'm disheartened by some of my colleagues that don't feel the same way, because I don't understand it. I don't understand why we can't have inclusive female spaces. So I think, you know, that, you know, I'd love to go down that route at some point about how to move forward with that in Inverclyde, because it's much needed.
Well, if you do, we'd be happy to help.
Yes.
Count me in.
Val's always been the more politically minded of the two of us. I spent my 20s and 30s partying. I did go. What can I say? It was the 80s. It was the 90s.
I'm jealous. 80s are my thing.
Yeah, I say that. I was making babies. Lisa was partying.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's definitely going to be a takeaway for me, the idea that over our lifetime things will change for us and our identity might change when new generations come along and teach us something new. I really love that idea. I'd never thought about it like that, so thank you for that insight. Does anyone else have anything that they want to share with us? Anyone that's... Frankie, go ahead.
Yeah, it was just quite interesting to hear everyone talking about flagging, given that I didn't really come out and everyone just guessed, so maybe I just give off big gay vibes without noticing. I was going to talk about around women's spaces and trans people, and the kind of, I think, I'm not sure who I think I might have been talking to Katie or Annie about it the other week, about some of the backlash around trans inclusion in women's spaces seems to come from people that don't necessarily know what a women's space is, which I found quite amusing, and also people that don't seem to know what the law is. But I think that's kind of when I was talking about how things have gotten easier, I think there's kind of a bit of a sort of a mismatch. So like, I think there's definitely a bigger visibility of the LGBT community, and I think it's generally easier to find people, particularly with social media and just generally, particularly in larger cities and through like popular media and stuff, there is a lot more visibility, and that feels a lot more accepting. And maybe this is a generational thing, but I feel like particularly for my generation, it's quite difficult to find a straight person, really. So that's definitely gotten a lot easier. But then I also feel like there's kind of particularly around trans people and non-binary identities and stuff, that there's a sort of backlash that's come in, and a lot of it seems to have sort of coincided with the proposals of legislative reform around the Gender Recognition Act. And it was quite interesting because I came out maybe 2017 or 18 and started doing a lot more work quite visibly around trans identities and educating people. I think it was around that time that the sort of kind of backlash around the sort of people not necessarily understanding what self-ID would mean and kind of speculating about all these sort of dangers that the veracity of it is a bit dubious, but that's become quite a visible thing, and particularly when there's more quite prominent people with columns in The Guardian and stuff that are then saying that people, sort of an appeal to authority. If J.K. Rowling says it, it must be true. Not to go too hard on J.K. Rowling in particular, but yeah, I feel like there's sort of a kind of split. So it's a lot easier in some ways, but I think there's also this kind of, I'd call it a backlash. But yeah, and also my mum lives in Greenock, so I just thought I'd point that out in terms of a women's space. I would happily pop in.
Greenock represent. I'm loving that.
I lived down there for like 2-3 years as well, just on the border of Gourock and Greenock. So this is kind of funny. A bunch of folk from kind of who've been down in Everglade kind of way, like, oh, hello.
And we all meet up in Johnston.
I know, right?
Yeah, it's noticeable that you all left.
Yeah.
Well, that's that.
I moved in.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Beyonce's doing the same. She's for Paisley. She's like, I quite like Greenock actually. And I was like, oh dear, okay.
I thought you said Beyonce for a second. I'm so sorry. And I was like, what?
Listen, Susie would love for that to be the case.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
From what Frankie was just saying, I think you're right, the whole kind of conflict that's existing right now about trans rights. And I think from the same as what Val and Lisa were saying about making sure that women's spaces are inclusive, and at Kairos, I don't think that's ever been a difficulty. I think we are inclusive and we talk about it overtly, and if anyone tells us there's other things that we could be doing that would make it feel more safe and inclusive, we will listen and we will attempt to do that. And the key thing underneath all of that is keeping women safe. And yeah. Oh, Ellie, come on.
I was just going to say that I think something that's been kind of a constant throughout and really needs to remain a really key focus is the intersectionality of things. Because, I mean, you look historically, for instance, and I know it's the one that everyone talks about, but you look at, for instance, 50 years ago, Stonewall, and you look at how it was Black trans women who were leading the change, leading the fight. And I think really for me, my passion is intersectional feminism. And I think we need to be aware of the sort of the patriarchal systems that are affecting women, but also the fact that those patriarchal capitalist structures are built to abuse LGBTQ plus and Black, Indigenous, people of color, women as well, more so. And I think just always keeping that sort of at the forefront of our minds when we're sort of fighting for equality, that there are so many crossovers and we really are all in this together. And I think the really important thing is when we're talking about inclusion and inclusivity in women's spaces is the fact that we're all fighting the same struggle. We're all fighting for basic sort of equality. And some people may have sort of more systems of oppression fighting them than others. But if we're not tackling all of those structures, then we're never going to achieve actual equality. And this is why I see, for instance, trans activism as a feminist activism. It's not its own separate little bubble. Fighting for LGBTQ plus rights and fighting for anti-racism and anti-sexism, all of this comes under feminism. And of course, it has its own, all of these elements have their own, huge groups as well. But for me, it really is feminism that is gonna actually tackle these. And if we're all fighting within us, then we're never actually going to achieve anything. And that's why I think these groups like this one, for instance, where we actually are inclusive, and we're constantly trying to learn new things to constantly better ourselves, and accepting the fact that we're never going to be perfect, but we just need to keep on trying, is so essential. And it makes me really proud to see that groups like this actually exist, where that is the philosophy, because that is how we achieve equality.
Whew. Yeah, Ellie, that was just, yeah. I have tears in my eyes. That
even Fluff tried to get in on that there. I saw that.
It was nearly in. That was so beautifully put, and I think that I wholeheartedly agree with everything that you just said. And I think it's so important that we're all fighting for the rights of all women and non-binary people, and that we do recognise that we've all got things in common, things that bind us, things that bring us together, and also celebrate those differences too. And I love spaces like this where we can do a bit of that and hear different opinions and different stories and learn from each other, because I think that's one of the things that's missing at the moment, those spaces where we can sit down across from other people that have got different lives and different experiences and listen to them. Because for me, that's the richest place to learn and understand yourself and leave feeling nourished and like you've got a different perspective. It really doesn't get better than that as a human, does it? So thank you so much, Ellie. That was beautifully put. Has anyone got any final thoughts? We're finishing at 7:30. I could stay here all night. But any final thoughts from anyone? If you can follow Ellie, that is. Feel free to raise your hand. Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know that I can follow that because I was sitting here nodding my head very vigorously. Yeah, for me as well as I'm sure it is for a lot of us, kind of intersectionality is where it's at really, is making sure that when you're fighting for LGBT equality, you're fighting for the entire LGBT community. You're not just fighting for the people maybe that have tended to dominate those spaces. You're making sure that you're keeping an eye on who's not around the table and why not, and how do we work to break down those barriers. Obviously, I mean, and maybe people get sick of it, maybe they don't. I come from the kind of LGBT disabled person's perspective, because that's, two elements of my identity, not the only ones, but in terms of what's still to be done, as a community, it can still be very inaccessible I think there's a lot of work that needs to still be done there. I think it's getting better, and I think we are creating spaces like this one, you know, where people can be entirely themselves, you know, where there aren't barriers, where we can get together and we can learn from each other, and we can hear, we're able to hear, oh, maybe you're getting it wrong, without it being a threat, with it being a kind of a welcome into a discussion, rather than putting up a wall. But I think, sorry, I'm rambling, but just that kind of idea of constantly checking ourselves, who's not here, why are we not here, what can we do to make sure that we're reaching out to people who are perhaps the most marginalised within our community.
Yeah.
And it's not about who has it worse or who has it better, it's just about recognising that perhaps some people have several barriers in the way of allowing them to participate and being part of breaking those down. And I think as a community we're strong enough, we're diverse enough that we can be an instrument for doing that. Not just in terms of creating a more accessible community, but in terms of breaking down the barriers in the wider world as well. I think we can be a force for doing that. But yeah, it takes a lot of self-awareness, and it takes a willingness to get it wrong, and challenge it and change it.
Thank you so much, Susan. Again, I completely agree. I think, yeah, we've got a lot to do, but I think the key thing is to just keep coming together like this and sharing stories, experiences, lives with each other. And to end, really, I just wanted to thank you all for being here and for bringing yourselves to this space. I know we've not heard from some of you, but you have been here and have seen you. So hopefully you'll be back next time. We hope to have another one of these in January time to reflect again in this same way. So feel free to come back, and if you have something to say next time, we would love to hear it. Anyone that wants to come to we've got a history group that runs every Wednesday at 1 o'clock, but next week we've got Our Story Scotland coming, who are an LGBT history group, so they've got a lot of LGBT archives, so they're coming along just for an hour next Wednesday from 1 till 2 on Zoom. It's a different link, but if you just message us, you're welcome to come along just to hear what Donald, who's coming along, has to say and share with us. And we hope to see you again very, very soon. Thank you very much to our guests for putting it all out there and for helping us learn a little bit, and for all of those who shared some of their stories. I'm just really grateful, and I'm going to go away and just sit down and be thankful and grateful for each one of you. So thank you very, very much. A little round of applause for our guests. Hooray!